So, this video lecture is about Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's probably not as spooky as I intended it to be, but that's okay. So this is a late Victorian horror story. And the Victorians loved horror. They loved ghosts and ghouls and goblins and things like this, which is partially an outgrowth of the Gothic. But Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde combines this sort of love of horror, this love of suspense and terror and things like this, with contemporary concerns about and understandings of science. And for me, we get Henry Jekyll's sort of faith that science can solve any problem, which is a very Victorian understanding of the world. It's a very Victorian faith in science. So we get that on the one level, a sort of basic level of plot. But I think there's two sciences that are more important and that give us a greater insight into this story as such. One of these is psychoanalysis. So, in the late Victorian period, Freud and Breuer are starting work in Vienna, Austria. So they're starting to lay the groundwork for what will become psychoanalysis. Now, by the time, 1885, by the time that Robert Louis Stevenson writes Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the ideas of psychoanalysis are not well known in Britain. They don't become well known in Britain really until the 1920s, when a lot of Freud's works get translated to English. But we can see in this novel that some of these ideas that will become foundations of psychoanalysis are in the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist would be the sort of intellectual climate of the period. This would be the set of ideas that are sort of swirling throughout the time period. And basically this is an idea, this is a set of ideas that we get in, especially this section, Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case, starting on 1709, we get this sense of a lot of psychoanalytic principles, particularly the return of the repressed, being fundamental to this. And indeed, on 1709, Jekyll describes himself as having a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high, and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection, and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. So, Jekyll tells us very directly that he has repressed his desires, he has repressed his maybe sexuality, he has repressed his vivacity, whatever it is. And then we get here to 1710, and we get very distinctly the return of the repressed, sort of stated directly for the first time. 1710, this is about halfway down the first full paragraph, he says, I've been made to learn that the doom and burthen of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it but returns upon us more unfamiliar and more awful pressure. So the idea here, and this is one of the principles of psychoanalysis, is that when you repress desire, when you repress instincts and drives and things like this, they return in a distorted form. So, and Victorian society was socially a fairly repressed society. This was a society where sexuality was punished, sexuality was avoided and repressed and tamped down. This is a society where the temperance movement flourishes, so people are opposed to drinking alcohol, and this is a society very concerned with dignity and sort of self-sacrificing service to others. So this is a society very much interested in repression, and so Stevenson here, in one sense, is giving us a story about what happens when you repress desires, sexuality, fantasy, what in psychoanalysis we might call jouissance, the unmitigated enjoyment, and what happens when you repress desire is that it returns in a distorted form. And the distorted form in this case is Edward Hyde, because the purpose of Jekyll's experiment is ultimately to separate the evil part of himself out and keep the good part. Now, of course, it doesn't work that way. He separates out the evil, and he sort of fails to isolate the good. But he says that what happened, we get this very interesting notion here that, this is 1711, he says that the evil part of his nature was smallish, dwarfish, as they call it, because it had been sort of unexercised. And this is where we actually get into another really interesting set of ideas, philosophy, theory, social understanding, that guides the way that I understand Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was smaller in stature, he was less sort of muscular, less sizable, because Jekyll had exercised him less. That's the theory. And then as Hyde spends more and more time out sort of enjoying on behalf of Jekyll, he gets stronger, both sort of more able to take over control from Jekyll and sort of physically larger. But we get this sort of confusion of identity. And this is, again, central to this sort of psychoanalytic component here. We have another Return of the Repressed reference here on 1715 that's really just sort of perfect. He said, "My devil had been long caged, he came out roaring." And this is exactly the Return of the Repressed. This sort of notion that the thing, the desire, the negative energy, the violence and sexuality that are not sort of vented in a healthy way come out in an unhealthy way. But it's like another sort of interesting psychoanalytic component of this is Jekyll's simultaneous identification with and rejection of Hyde. So on 1711 he says, "When I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human." So, on the one hand, Jekyll identifies himself with Hyde. Hyde doesn't identify himself with Jekyll, but Jekyll says, Hyde is also part of me. He's the evil part of myself. And this is crucial. And this is actually fairly straightforward. Like, we can accept that, because Hyde is a sort of distilled out evil essence of Jekyll. But what's really interesting and really sort of problematic for that reading is when Jekyll dissociates himself from Hyde. So he says here, this is the top of page 1713, after talking about, so he's talking in this paragraph at the bottom of 1712 about Hyde going out and doing these sort of horrible things, these bestial things that Hyde does. He says, top of 1713, Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste where it was possible to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. So we have here, again, this dissociation from Hyde. So, on the one hand, Jekyll is Hyde. On the other hand, Jekyll rejects Hyde. So, this is a sort of complex relationship between the two of them, because at one point in the narrative we have Jekyll saying, I am Hyde. Hyde is part of me and from me. At another point in the narrative, he has Jekyll saying, I'm Henry Jekyll, that's Edward Hyde. What he has done is Edward Hyde, and it's not Henry Jekyll. So we have this confusion. And it's a problem, but it's a complication of the way that Jekyll understands himself in relation to his own repressed emotions and what those repressed emotions mean. But the other sort of scientific component of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that I find really interesting, and I think this idea is always going to color the way that I read the novella, is this idea of devolution. So I mentioned this in the introductory video for this reading list. There are a lot of concerns that having people sort of living in urban poverty, in slums, in close proximity to one another without sort of adequate access to healthy food, sunlight, proper exercise, clean air, and so on, would cause people to devolve into a more sort of bestial, ape-like form of humanity. And this is Hyde. I mean, Hyde is this sort of weird, small, ape-like dude. So we get a number of descriptions of Hyde, which are very interesting. We get this one, 1684. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. And then he says, Utterson sort of thinks to himself at the top of 1685, there is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human, something troglodytic, shall we say. And, of course, a troglodyte would be a sort of Neanderthal, early human, cave dweller kind of creature. So, this idea is actually what we would in psychoanalysis call the uncanny, something that is similar but slightly different, slightly distorted in such a way that it causes sort of fear and aversion. So Hyde is the human filtered through something, filtered through an unknown but unsettling sort of frame. We find out from Jekyll, or according to Jekyll, that this is the distilled evil of human nature. But we also have this sense, let me find it. I mean, we have this sense of Jekyll's house. or of Hyde's house, rather. It's not this far. Because Hyde's neighborhood, Hyde's house, is in this very sort of dirty, this very sort of depressing, oh, why can't I find it? Oh, here we go. Yeah, so Hyde lives in this sort of dirty, depressing, impoverished, degenerated slum, Soho. So he says, 1689, we get this description of Hyde's immediate neighborhood. As the cab drew up before the address indicated, the fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace, a low French eating house, a shop for the retail of penny numbers and twopenny salads, many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of many different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. So, I mean, Soho, we know, or we would know if we were sort of contemporaries of Robert Louis Stevenson, we would know that Soho is a sort of byword for a slum. But then we get this really fairly quick description here on 1689, and we get this sense that this is an area with low quality shops. This is an era where mothers are drinking in the morning and children are playing in rags in the streets and things like this. This is not a nice place. But we get this sense, and I think this would again be more evident in the context of fears of urban devolution than it is necessarily to a lot of readers today. We get this sense that one of the reasons why Hyde is small and sort of uncannily deformed-ish, he's not really deformed, but there's this sense that he's not fully human. And one of the interpretations of this that bears a great deal of currency in the Victorian era is this sense that he is the devolved urban dweller. And we get a lot of descriptions of him as bestial and ape-like. And in Dr. Jekyll's narrative at the end of the story, 1713, we get this description of Hyde's hand. So, the hand was lean, corded knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. This is an ape-like hand. So we get this sense, and indeed he says, Jekyll says at the top of 1719, ape-like tricks of Mr. Hyde. So we get this sense that maybe the thing that is uncanny or unsettling about Hyde is not necessarily just that he is a distilled evil, but that he is the human degenerated and devolved by the urban experience and by urban poverty, this sort of repressed class. The return of the repressed, again, in this sort of social sense, because the poor, the downtrodden, and the oppressed social classes of Britain return in this distorted, violent, angry form of Mr. Hyde.